Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Patrick Henningsen, your host. This is the Sunday Wire, brought to you by ACR, the Alternate Current Radio Network. We took a short station break because we had to just do a little bit of adjustment on the schedule. We had William Engdahl booked for the top of the hour, but we're moving that forward, and I've got him on the line right now. Author and geopolitical analyst F. William Engdahl is joining us this week. Hello, William.
Hello, Patrick. Good to be with you again.
Great to be with you too, William. And there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of important things going on. We've linked to a couple of your recent articles up on William Engdahl on your website on the show page right now. And two of them, William, one of them is obviously about the weaponization of the dollar, and that's the first thing we want to talk about. And if we have time to talk about the Xinjiang province in Western China and what's going on there, and how that might affect the Belt and Road project going forward. But in terms of the financial, I mean, everybody's watching the news, William. And I think it's a kind of a consensus that there are a number of bubbles right now. And I was hoping you could give us a little insight of what some of these major bubbles to look out for. You've alluded to some of these in your article, especially with regards to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates and what that could mean to the world economy, and why so many people are exposed as well to this problem. But I think we're on with the stock market, in the recent dip in the stock market. Everybody's talking about there's a major correction coming. There's the interest rate issues big. William, what are you looking at right now is the thing that people really have to look out for?
I think what we're witnessing is the deliberate triggering by the Federal Reserve yet again, of a major blowout of a financial bubble that the Federal Reserve, after 2008 September, deliberately created when they brought interest rates down to zero and held them virtually at that level, unprecedented in central banking history in the U.S. for a decade, almost a decade. And what that created was the atmosphere where banks could virtually borrow for nothing and relend at higher interest rates. And they naturally went to where the returns were greatest. As long as the money was flowing, they went to high-risk emerging market countries like Turkey, like Indonesia, to a certain extent China later in the day, and Russia before the sanctions really got onerous about a year and a half ago. And then inside the U.S., it created bubbles everywhere. As some economists call it the everything bubble. It created a bubble again in housing, subprime real estate, no interest loans, liar loans, the whole shebang that we had back in 2003, 2007, 8, around under Greenspan, before he got out in a timely fashion to drop the loaded hand grenade on Ben Bernanke's lap. And we have a bubble in junk bonds for not only shale oil, but almost anything you can mention. We have a bubble in college loans of $1.3 trillion in the U.S. And when the stock market and the higher interest rates cause any one of these bubbles to begin popping, the thing will have a snowballing effect that will go through the entire economy, so that people with these high interest college loans will be unable to service those loans. So the Fed once again has deliberately initiated a reorganization or reset of the global financial system. And the effects of that start at the so-called periphery, the emerging market countries, and now they're coming back in to the central core, to Europe, especially Italy, where you have a very unstable situation there with the state debt indebtedness. And now slowly it's beginning to hit the U.S. bond market, and then from there it goes into the stock market because higher interest rates are traditionally not healthy for business expansion. So the liquidity is drying up. It's called quantitative tightening by some. It's the opposite of quantitative easing, when the Fed simply brought interest rates down to zero and was giving what Bernanke called helicopter money into the economy. But it didn't really go into the economy. This is the tragic thing about it. It went into the big banks, and the big banks loaned it out all around the world wherever risk was highest, but return rates were highest as long as the money flowed. So once you shift the supertanker of the Federal Reserve money creation machine into reverse, it begins to have a chilling effect on the entire global economy.
And William, so in terms of there's a lot of countries, and we won't get into the details of how this came to be, but let's just suffice to say the Bretton when the Bretton Woods system turned over with Nixon, and it went off the gold standard, and then it became the petrodollar, and a lot of countries have basically recycling petrodollars, but also buying U.S. debt, and so in a sense, the world, even the emerging markets, they're financing U.S. Government deficit spending in a way, and but they're all hooked on dollars. And the cheaper the better. So what you're saying, William, is that it's like a drug addict who's hooked on heroin, and all of a sudden the price goes up, and there's no way they can get off because they're so dependent on the dollar. It's very hard to get off, but it's going to be. What's that going to mean, William? Is that austerity across the board in some of these countries? Does it mean they're going to have to cut back on social programs, food subsidies? I'm talking about Africa, Asia, emerging markets. How is this going to affect them?
All of that. It's going to look at the interest rates of the central bank in Argentina, one of the affected countries of this process. It's over 60%. I mean, that's impossible. The interest rates in Turkey are something like 24% the last time I looked. And again, you can't have a healthy economy, industrial economy, investment in infrastructure and so forth at those interest rates. The whole scenario is taking place parallel with the Trump trade war strategy. So I think what we're watching is a slow motion, which can very quickly turn into a fast motion, destruction of growth on a world scale. And who benefits from that? This seems like it's mad if you say the U.S. is doing this. It's not the U.S. It's what I call the title of one of my books on this, Gods of Money, the Titans of Wall Street and City of London. And they create the money. They create the crashes. Historically, the 1929 stock market crash was deliberately created by the Federal Reserve in collusion with Montague Norman of the Bank of England in order to stabilize Britain and the gold standard at the expense of the creating a stock market bubble that then they popped in 1929 October. So this is the game. They create artificial bubbles. The whole economic study of business cycle theory is hogwash, to put it bluntly. It's the cycles of Federal Reserve or central bank money creation and money destruction. And each time you have one of these cycles, the control, look at the size of the balance sheet of JP Morgan Chase, of Goldman Sachs, of Bank of America and so forth, before 2007, and look at the size of their balance sheet today. And that's where the money has gone. That's where the money has gone. And it's a creation, centralization of financial power in the hands of ever fewer mega banks, global banks, that are part of this dollar system, as I call it.
And the amazing thing is that so many countries that have accumulated large amounts of dollar debt, they're having to take out loans. What's been okay when it's at zero interest or just above zero. There's cheap money available to service your old loans, but when interest rates go up, and this is what you're saying is happening right now at the Federal Reserve in the United States, then those dollars become more expensive.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, and that changes the whole balance sheet, doesn't it, for any country that has basically been relying on all this cheap money now for 10 years since 2008?
It's unprecedented. And then those borrowings, those debts have to be rolled over periodically. They're more and more short-term borrowings. And if the cost of rolling that over goes up dramatically, say in relative terms by 50% over the course of 6 months, you're in deep trouble. And that's what's going on. That's what's going on in Turkey. It's what's going on in Indonesia, in Argentina, in Brazil, in South Africa, and so forth, to an extent in Russia. But there it's more the political sanctions war that's going on with the U.S.
Wow. So I know a lot of people don't look at the Federal Reserve as, let's say, part of the international. A lot of people will look at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is the central bank of the United States, is a private bank which issues the money. And we'll look at it as a U.S. institution, but a lot of people won't relate to it as an international institution. They also won't relate to it in terms of the Federal Reserve projecting power or even controlling the balance of power internationally. But William, isn't this in this way? Doesn't the Federal Reserve really have the equivalent of more? It's actually more powerful than the military if you look at it in terms of the balance of power. And if you determine a country's capabilities and power based on their financial worth or their financial capabilities, because let's face it, you need money to buy weapons, to raise armies, to patrol your seas and your interests at home and away. So really, could you look at the Fed as a tool of imperialism, let's say? Is that a fair assessment?
It's a tool of, Kissinger said back in the 1970s when he was Secretary of State and really running the Nixon administration policy during the oil crises and the grain crisis. He said, if you control the money, you control the entire world. And that's basically it. What I document in my book, The Gods of Money, Wall Street and the Death of the American Century, is this globalization process of the power of the Wall Street banks, not your neighborhood saving and loan or local banks and so forth, but the Wall Street, here we're talking about 7, at the most 8 mega banks that are said to be too big to fail. They're not, but that's the myth that they propagate. And those banks dominate world finance. The reason that the United States can get away with acts of war, financial, economic warfare against Russia, against China, against Turkey, and so forth, with its sanctions through the Treasury, is that the dollar and the money creation of those banks dominates the entire world economy. 60% of all central bank reserves are in U.S. dollars. So as long as that is the reality, then these countries are completely at the mercy of the lunatics in Washington at the U.S. Treasury and in the Wall Street Federal Reserve complex. So these are private interests, as you point out. The Federal Reserve, this is one of the greatest political deceptions of modern history. The Federal Reserve was created by J.P. Morgan, by the Rockefeller faction, by Kuhn, Loeb, and others back in 1913 as a coup d'etat against the American Constitution. A seemingly public central bank. They went through this charade that the president nominates the chairman of the Fed, and then the regional Feds, constitute their own membership and so forth to the central committee, if you will, of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. But the reality is the New York Fed, which has a board of directors dominated by purely private corporation interests, people like J.P. Morgan Chase or AIG Insurance and so forth. This is who controls our money supply. We gave that control up in 1913 December when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act that allowed J.P. Morgan to finance the British and the French against Germany in the First World War. And from then on, it's been the key to build an empire. You want to talk about empire. The key to building an empire using a naive American population that has been lied to systematically since the creation of the Fed in 1913 to create that empire of money. It's not an empire in the sense that American troops are everywhere. They're in far too many places as it is for the good of the country or the American people or the world. But the real point is the empire of money, and that's the real danger of the Fed.
So in terms of monetary hegemony, we're talking about global, like what you said, an empire of money. This isn't the first time that this has happened, although this is the latest, most pervasive, most well-distributed system in history. But before that, the British Empire had a similar. They had their sort of version of globalization with sterling. But also with their sort of globalization free market within the British colonies and the British trading outposts around the world. And I think it was Lord Rosenberg that said, it was in 1890, he said, we've got 40-something wars going on simultaneously. There's nowhere on this planet, there's nowhere that British interests do not touch. And he said, the problem is we have to defend those interests. Hence, we're in 43 different conflicts globally. And he said, this isn't sustainable. Do you think America even if they pull back their military, and I see that, William, happening, there's talk of, a change in geopolitical positioning militarily in the Pacific with Korea, possible detente there, unification of the Korean Peninsula, plus maybe pulling out of Germany, maybe pulling some assets out of the Middle East, although they're still putting other assets in other places. But even then, William, even if America pulled all of its military assets, you can take the boats back, but you can't pull the dollars back. The dollars stay. So that's the real power. The alternative is ironically being forced by the Trump sanctions war against China, against Russia, against all these countries. It's forcing them to closer economic and even military, but political cooperation. And now even the European Union around the Iranian sanctions from the Trump administration is talking about creating a special purpose vehicle together with Russia and China to continue to avert or avoid the effect of the U.S. economic sanctions for buying Iranian oil for their economies. Mm-hmm. So this, and also in Europe, there's talk about an alternative to the SWIFT, the interbank payment system that's dominated in many ways by U.S. banks, even though it's based in Luxembourg, mm-hmm. and or in Belgium, and they're talking about alternatives to SWIFT. The Chinese are doing the same thing. The Russians are doing the same thing, because what happened with the Iranian sanctions when the Obama administration pressed the SWIFT interbank payment corporation in Europe to cancel SWIFT clearing for any oil payments of the Iranian government. And that was a devastating blow to Iran, the first time SWIFT has intervened in a political way, in that overt way. And now the danger is that will be done again. So once burned, twice cautious. And the more that happens, the more there will be a de-dollarization of big chunks of the world economy. We have some ways to go before that. We shouldn't be euphoric. This is really financial warfare at the highest level.
but it's a war to continue a certain kind of dollar denomination that is without country. It's without country. They destroy their own domestic population and economy as much as they destroy that in Europe, Italy, in Argentina, in Turkey, in China, whatever. So this dollar central bank model is a model of wealth destruction of anyone who gets in their way.
It's I think Michael Hudson, the economist, super imperialism, he called it in his book in 2003. I think you quoted him actually in one of your books.
Yes, I did. Gods of Money. I quote him. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how difficult is this? Let's say I have noticed, William, in the last couple of months, in fact, this week, China, Russia has relinquished a lot of its dollar holdings in the last 18 months. I think they've reduced, something incredible like 80% in terms of their dollar holdings. China is also reducing its dollar holdings. A number of countries are. But, William, even if they do that, and even if they raise interest rates, and if there's a global economic crash and so many people are exposed and economies are ruined, they can then just start the next cycle. They can lower interest rates again, bailouts, cheap money, and then everybody, because the dollar is so liquid, it still has liquidity on its side, and people will get hooked on it again. So it's a very difficult to de-dollarize with the cycles.
I agree with that, Patrick. It's very difficult. The problem from the standpoint of the money masters at the Fed and Wall Street is that interest rates are still incredibly low historically, and therefore when they bring interest rates back down from a level of 2.25% for Fed funds, they don't have much playroom. That's the dilemma that they're in. So that's why Fed Chairman Powell talks about bringing rates back to normal, regardless of stock market consequences or whatever. They're in a very, very dicey situation for all the power that they have, and it requires that they really get either they go to extraordinary means, but that's what they always do. The creation of the Lehman Brothers crisis in 2008 was an extraordinary measure to threaten to bring down the global financial architecture, and they almost did. So, but this time, I think what they're having in mind are draconian measures like bank bail-ins, where the depositors in banks will be held liable, like in Cyprus a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. They will be held liable for the sins of the board of directors of those banks like Morgan or Citigroup. And if that happens, God forbid, that means your deposits aren't safe anymore in a federally insured bank. Mm. So all these laws are on the books since 2008. It's been quiet. It's been done. So I think either countries like China and Russia are going to have to develop their own blockchain ledger parallel exchange systems that are unbreakable from the SWIFT or from the dollar U.S. Treasury. It's emergency measures in a situation of de facto war. Financial war is war, just as sanctions are acts of war.
Yes, and so let's look at Donald Trump right now. Some people will call this, William, a kind of neo-mercantilist stance economically, high tariffs, reorganizing, renegotiating trade deals, pulling out of multilateral deals or eschewing multilateral institutions. So is this to create Fortress America or Fortress Britain and America in order to insulate itself from a calamity outside of its walls? Do you see, can you read what the bigger grand strategy is with what we're seeing right now?
I think the bigger grand strategy is using these trade war attacks to throw China and much of the world, Europe, Canada even, completely off balance in order to centralize more power. The empire is collapsing. The empire is failing over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years. 2008, I think, was a pivotal turn. And they need desperate measures to regroup their power on the global stage. And the effect of the trade war has nothing to do with how many dollars of goods China makes for American companies and then re-exports back into the United States. It has to do with preventing China from becoming a modern, high-tech industrial manufacturing nation and not just screwdriver assembly for iPads or Apple devices in China that are sold under an American company, but marketing Chinese technology that's Chinese owned. And that's not going to be allowed. That wasn't allowed in the lead up to 1914 and World War I, when Britain didn't allow Germany to do the same or a very similar thing. So this is I think, what's going on. They want to create a global, if you will, corporativism. Mussolini called that fascism, but it was corporativism, where the giant corporations and banks dominated the political process, dominated the trade union process, dominated the population with some ideology thrown in. So I think they're trying to bite off a huge change globally with all this action, and the world doesn't work that smoothly. If you do one country at a time or put pressure on Germany for certain things, maybe that might have a short-term effect. But doing it this way is really all or nothing, going for broke, and that's I think it's doomed to fail ultimately. But in the short term, it can cause huge damage to the world.
Well, certainly in terms of Trump's domestic political strategy, he's trying to extract as much political capital out of bringing jobs home as possible, and certainly there's some political motivation to package it that way. But you mentioned China, William, and I was reading your article, which we've linked to. It's up on your website, on the weaponization of the dollar, and there's some pretty disturbing numbers there, William, with regards to the IMF's report on Chinese debt. Not just China, by the way, a number of other emerging economies, but especially China. Huge growth, William, in dollar-denominated debt. How exposed are China to a potential shock?
Well, the IMF translates the Chinese renminbi yuan debt into dollars, so it's not borrowing in dollars for 36 trillion, as mentioned in the article. I should have made that more clear, but they have huge domestic debt. Now, the one unique, I would say, in terms of major economies, the one unique difference between China and the U.S. is that the People's Bank of China, PBOC, is a state institution controlled directly by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And for anyone who's been following Chinese politics, Xi Jinping is consolidating power through the party around him and his dictates in a way that no one since the time of Mao Zedong has done in China. So they can wipe that debt off in a minute. The banks that are involved in the Chinese market, are Chinese banks, are state-owned banks. So this is one advantage if you don't give away your Federal Reserve to private bankers, but keep it in the hands of the state, the government. You have great possibilities for financial maneuver. The problem is China is also holding $1.3 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury paper, and that if that's impounded in some way by Washington, that could have a devastating blow to Chinese international trade. So it's they're in a precarious situation from that standpoint, and Chinese that I've talked with, experts on international finance who are Chinese nationals, have told me that using this trade war as a attack weapon has been a devastating blow to China. They lie about how well their economy is doing, but in reality, the economic stresses are enormous in China over the last 6 or 8 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I noticed, for years Japan has been the number one oil importer in the Pacific Rim, and that's this part of East Asia, and China is now surpassing them in terms of oil imports, and that's only going to grow, William. The trajectory on China in terms of fuel consumption is just massive. Upwards trajectory. So there, and a lot of the millions of barrels of oil that they're buying every month, those are going to be bought in dollars as well. So they do need to keep a lot of dollars, China, in order to. They do. Yeah, they do. What they're doing is trying to shift a little bit of that over to Russia to buy Russian oil. Russia is the biggest or second biggest producer after Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. if you include that, but and Iran now. So how that works with the sanctions on November 4 is yet to be seen. But I would say, to pull all this together, the American superpower, the sole hegemon, is in a rage state against the entire world, trying to regroup its leverage to control the wealth of the world, essentially. And the world is not too happy with that, most of the world. So how people come together, I mean, many of these governments are corrupt governments, but that's not the point. The point is politically where they go with their policies to counter the dollar. And people like Paul Craig Roberts have rightly pointed out, this is the Achilles heel, and if they don't somehow get out from the domination of the dollar system, they're toast, to put it bluntly. Yeah, and a lot of people are diversifying. You mentioned crypto. I know Venezuela launched the sort of crypto bolivar, as it were, which is, I think it's
Petro,
called the Petro, and that's kind of linked to the oil trade. So there is diversification, but as you said, William, earlier, this is a long process, and it's not anything that can happen overnight. So meanwhile, the Emperor Nero in Washington D.C. is setting a light to the world, and it's attacking his enemies, attacking his friends, attacking everybody, basically. Yeah. So it is. This has all the signs of an empire in decline, William. So it's just to me a question of time.
It does, and it's really unprecedented in post 20th century history, or the history of the last century. Let's say the British Empire was a much more predictable demise, because you had the rise of the American Empire, even though they don't call it an American Empire. But now China is not in a position to gently rise up to be the dominating lion of the world economy. It's not there. It's got huge problems, domestic and technological, militarily and otherwise. So keep in mind, it was a 30 years war between 1914 and 1944 that decided that the U.S. would be the sole hegemon after World War II.
Mm. And so one of the last things I wanted to talk about, we'll move from the financial warfare, or the financial terrorism, as some people might call it, looking at China's Belt and Road projects, and this has obviously been on the books for a long time. I think Brzezinski talked about it, in the late 90s, even in one of his books. But the Belt and Road project. So this is about connecting Asia with Europe via the Middle East. So we're talking about overland trade routes, but also naval trade routes as well, and a combination of both. And we have a situation in Western China that seems to be getting a lot of media attention right now, William, in the Western province and the plight of the Uyghur people. And we see a lot of people out there. If anyone's listening, you've probably seen the stories. 1 million interned in camps, but it's very difficult to know exactly what the situation is. I know you've been following this, William, but if you could just give us a quick summary of what you think is happening in I think it's Xinjiang province. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Xinjiang province happens to be the crossroads of all the crucial energy pipelines that go from Kazakhstan, from Russia, Central Asia, into Chinese economy. And Xinjiang province also has a sizable Uyghur minority of Muslim background. The Turks call it East Turkmenistan. And the CIA, going back to the Cold War, and people But anyway, the CIA, going back to the Cold War, the name slips me at the moment, but Graham E. Fuller talked about using Muslims to control the economic power of China, the way the CIA used Muslims in Afghanistan during the 1980s, the Mujahideen, to destroy the Russian influence in Central Asia and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So the CIA has been involved in bringing, initially when Turkey was very much dominated by Fethullah Gulen, and who was a CIA protege and had a huge network inside Turkey, still does, by my estimation. But they would bring Uyghur students on a study visa to Istanbul, and then the intelligence services would kidnap them and bring them into training camps run by Mossad, by Turkish MIT intelligence, by CIA, and so forth. This was back in 2009, 2011, around the beginning of the Arab Spring, Hillary Clinton's Arab Spring. And then they would send them into Syria to become terrorists against Al-Qaeda or later ISIS, against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now what's been happening is these seasoned terrorists are being sent back into China to be sleeper agents in Xinjiang province, where these crucial energy pipelines crisscross, or other parts of China even. And this is a ticking time bomb. So it's clear that Xi Jinping and the government are very alarmed about the situation. If 1 million Uyghurs are detained in these concentration camps, I can't say. It's most of the evidence comes from open society web pages or organizations that are tied to Radio Free Asia, which is a CIA communication front for the government. So it's very hard to independently judge. But at the very least, it's a huge problem for China, and they're very alarmed about it. So I think that's the essential point. I'm by no means enthusiastic about some of the signals that I see coming out of even Chinese state media about differences of opinion and so forth. But the difficulty is when you have such a precarious economic situation, then it's very easy to have sleeper agents like in Hong Kong start suddenly demanding independence for Hong Kong from mainland China, a referendum or this or that, and then that goes to mainland China and it spreads like wildfire, because you still, incredibly enough, the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA front created under Reagan, still spends up to $7 million a year on different projects in China. So the Chinese have huge holes in their, gaping holes in their state security apparatus.
Yeah, the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, and a lot of these, they're funded directly by the U.S. State Department. And, of course, these were some of the main actors in the Ukraine, William, in the run-up to that coup d'etat, which a lot of people from the Obama administration don't like to use the word coup for some reason. They get very upset when you say there was the coup in the Ukraine, but...
Well, George Friedman, the founder of Stratfor, which is a Pentagon-linked private intelligence service, was quite open. He said this was the most blatant coup d'etat in U.S. history, the Ukraine in 2014 February. And Victoria Nuland, the assistant secretary, was playing a key role, as did Vice President Biden, and John Brennan, the knuckle-dragging ex-head of the CIA, was deeply involved in that. So people just have to do basic research, and it's a lot of it's out there, despite all the censorship going on by Google and Facebook and company. It's there to be found. The scrubbing isn't yet complete, but we better move quickly because it's expanding. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we'll keep an eye on the situation in Western China. Certainly that's looks like that's kind of bubbling up right now. We're seeing Samantha Power and a lot of the usual responsibility protect suspects, trying to Human Rights Watch, etc., trying to elevate this issue and get the international community outraged over what's going on in Western China. So we'll keep an eye on that, but certainly that's got to worry the Chinese in terms of rolling out the Belt and Road project and a lot of the different energy projects that are meant to connect up Eurasia. So it's definitely something we'll keep an eye on. But William, before we go, we just got a minute left, but obviously you've got a couple of excellent books out. The Gods of Money, I know that you gave that a shout out earlier. Manifest Destiny, which I've read as well, which is excellent. But give us a lowdown, and I know you've also got some new projects which are going to be coming soon, I think.
Well, right now I'm in a reconceptualization of a new project on the whole ball of wax between the declining superpower U.S., but Wall Street and the Federal Reserve and the Pentagon and so forth, versus the world, and how to present that in an effective way. So that's a project that's some months off still, but that's the main one on the back burner at the moment.
Well, you can go to your website, William. We've got the links up on the show page. William Engdahl, ladies and gentlemen, a number of really essential books in terms of getting a good big picture look, especially in world finance. I do encourage people to go to his website and check those out. Pick up a couple of those books if you can. Especially, I highly recommend The Gods of Money, but there's also the GMO expose that William's done, Seeds of Destruction, and a number of other top titles there. You can find them, all those volumes, up at William's website right now. But William, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us this week.
Patrick, I'm more than happy to join you and look forward to the next time.
Okay. Thank you very much. There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is F. William Engdahl, author, geopolitical analyst, joining us on the live link from Europe this week on the Sunday Wire. We're going to take a short break. We're going to get back to what we're going to talk about, the Atlantic Council, after the break.